Imagine a judge ordering a man with 35 prior arrests to be released, and the local sheriff looking at that order and simply saying, no.
I mean, it sounds totally fabricated, right? Like a scene written for some daytime police drama.
Yeah, exactly. But it is exactly what just went down in Nevada.
It really is. And it's triggering this massive legal earthquake over who actually controls the justice system.
Right, so let's get you up to speed on the facts here, because this escalated incredibly fast. In Las Vegas, Justice Court Judge Eric Goodman ordered a man named Joshua Sanchez-Lopez to be released on electronic monitoring.
Right, and we should mention that Sanchez-Lopez has 35 prior arrests.
35.
Yeah, we're talking about a rap sheet that includes involuntary manslaughter.
Wow.
So Sheriff Kevin McMahill flat out refused to put him in the police-run monitoring program. He basically called him an unreasonable risk to public safety.
Right, so because the sheriff refused, the judge actually had to release the suspect through a different, lower-level program.
And then the climax hits.
Yeah. Police respond to a routine call, and they end up arresting Sanchez-Lopez for the 36th time.
Unbelievable.
And now he faces 27 new felony charges. So, the police, the courts, and politicians are all locked in this high-stakes showdown.
It really is a perfect storm. You have a judge enforcing the law exactly as he interprets the current statutes, and a sheriff who believes his fundamental duty to protect the public just, overrides that specific judicial order.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack a really thick stack of sources.
Yes, we have a lot to get through.
We've got local news reports, dense legal filings, and some really heavy statistical reports from the Nevada Department of Corrections.
Plus those national pretrial justice frameworks.
Right. And we're going to use all of this to understand this massive clash between judicial authority and law enforcement.
And just a quick heads up for you listening, this is a massive political lightning rod right now.
Oh, absolutely.
We've got sources screaming from both sides of the aisle here. So our goal today isn't to tell you who is right, and we certainly aren't endorsing any political viewpoint.
No, not at all.
We're simply here to map out the facts and the arguments exactly as they appear in the source material, just to help you understand the bigger picture of how your local justice system operates.
Okay, let's unpack this. If the law is supposed to be black and white, how do a judge and a sheriff end up in a legal standoff over the exact same rulebook?
Well, to figure that out, we really have to look closely at the timeline of what actually happened to Joshua Sanchez-Lopez back in January 2026.
Right.
He is 36 years old, and he was arrested for grand larceny of a motor vehicle, which is, basically stealing a car.
And like we mentioned earlier, this was not his first time in handcuffs.
Not even close.
The sources note his record includes drug sales, being a prohibited person with a firearm, and that involuntary manslaughter charge.
Plus, he had a history of fleeing from cops.
Right, so he goes before Las Vegas Justice Court Judge Eric Goodman, and the judge sets his bail at $25,000.
But the judge also orders high-level electronic monitoring.
And we should probably clarify what that actually means.
Right, it's important to understand. Because this isn't just some basic check-in. This is a strict program operated specifically by the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department.
Yeah, true.
Exactly, Metro. It acts exactly like house arrest. So the suspect wears a GPS ankle monitor, and they can only leave their residence for very specific pre-approved reasons.
Like going to work or attending a court date.
Right. And if they step out of bounds, alarms literally go off at Metro headquarters, and officers have to respond.
But then the judge's order reaches Sheriff Kevin McMahill's desk.
Yeah.
The sheriff and his team review the suspect's history. They see the high-speed chases. They see he once pointed a gun at an unsuspecting officer.
And the sheriff just refuses to participate.
He just says no.
Yeah. He refuses to authorize his officers to place the monitor on the suspect.
And what's really fascinating here is the specific logic the sheriff used to draw that hard line.
Oh, definitely. He argued that electronic monitoring cannot physically stop a dangerous person from committing a crime.
Right. It just tells law enforcement where they are when they do it.
Exactly. If a suspect decides to, cut the monitor off or go on a rampage, the police are still left chasing a dangerous individual. But now they are artificially responsible for him under this specific program.
So, because the sheriff refused to run the GPS tracking, Judge Goodman was basically boxed in.
He didn't have a lot of options.
Right. So he released Sanchez-Lopez into a lower-level pretrial compliance program instead.
And a lower-level program generally strips away that active GPS tracking.
Yeah, it usually relies on things like scheduled phone calls, maybe random drug testing, or just checking in with a civilian court worker.
Right, rather than being monitored 24/7 by armed police officers.
And shortly after that release, the twist happens.
The big twist.
Police get a call about a man stealing mail at an apartment complex. They arrive on the scene, and who is sitting in the driver's seat of the SUV?
Joshua Sanchez-Lopez.
The details of this 36th arrest are just absolutely wild. Wait, so they arrest him and search the place, right?
Yep, they do.
They find a shaved mail key, which is basically a filed-down key used to force open bulk mailboxes.
They find fraudulent IDs, stolen credit cards, and methamphetamine.
And it gets darker.
It really does. They also found what investigators described as an apparent fraud lab set up in the residence.
Oh, wow.
And worst of all, they found a woman and 8 children present in the home while all of this illegal activity was taking place.
8 kids. I mean, that sounds like a bad action movie script, not a random Tuesday afternoon.
Seriously. And because of all that, he now faces 27 new felony charges,
Including child abuse and mail theft.
which instantly turned what was a localized bureaucratic disagreement into this blazing national story.
Because for law enforcement, it proved the sheriff's fears were absolutely justified in this specific case.
Exactly. But zooming out, it raised these huge constitutional questions about who actually holds the power to decide a suspect's freedom.
So is this like a doctor writing a prescription for a patient, but the pharmacist refuses to fill it because they look at the patient's history and think the drug will actually harm people?
That is a great way to put it. And taking your doctor and pharmacist analogy a step further,
Yeah.
imagine if the pharmacist is the one who gets sued or loses their license, if the patient overdoses.
Oh.
That's the sheriff's perspective here.
Yeah.
The judge makes the legal diagnosis, but the sheriff is the one physically managing the risk out on the streets.
Because if the suspect reoffends, the public blames the police.
Always.
I get the sheriff's concern, I really do. But doesn't this set a terrifying precedent? I mean, if cops can just say no to a judge because they don't like the suspect's rap sheet, aren't we just throwing due process out the window?
And that brings us directly into the fierce legal and political arguments this 36th arrest sparked. We can break the two sides down pretty cleanly. On one side, you have the public defender, P. David Westbrook.
And he argues that the sheriff's actions violate basic constitutional rights, right?
Exactly. In his view, only elected judges have the power to set release conditions. That is fundamentally what judges do in the American legal system.
Right. They hear the evidence from both the prosecution and the defense in an open court, on the record, and they make a ruling based on the law.
And the public defender's main sticking point here is transparency.
Right. He argues that Metro is making these summary decisions to reject people from the program completely behind closed doors.
Yes, there are no checks and balances. The defense attorneys cannot even present their case or offer a rebuttal to the police when a suspect gets rejected.
Which Westbrook argues is a direct violation of due process.
Precisely. You cannot have the police simply ignore a judicial order because they personally disagree with the risk assessment.
Because that shatters the separation of powers.
Exactly. If the executive branch, meaning the police, can just veto the judicial branch, the judge, then the judge's gavel is basically useless.
But then you have law enforcement's side of the argument.
Right. Metro Attorney Mike Dickerson argues this isn't about ignoring the Constitution at all.
It's strictly about protecting the public and managing police resources.
Yeah. And state law actually grants the sheriff discretion over their specific electronic monitoring program.
So the police argue that because they fund the GPS monitors and because they are the ones deploying officers when a monitor alerts, they get the final say on who qualifies for their specific resources.
Yes. Sheriff McMahill says he simply cannot effectively supervise highly dangerous people with a piece of plastic on their ankle.
And we have to give some historical context here because this conflict didn't just fall out of the sky.
No, it's been building for a while.
The sources show this all stems from a major 2020 Nevada Supreme Court ruling called Valdez-Jimenez.
Right. And after that ruling, the state passed a 2021 law, Assembly Bill 424.
And these laws require courts to use the least restrictive means possible when setting bail.
Which is key here. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the intent behind those 2020 and 2021 reforms was to fix a very real problem: wealth-based detention.
Right, because for decades, the system operated in a way where a wealthy suspect could pay a massive cash bail and walk free pending trial.
While a poor suspect accused of the exact same crime would sit in a jail cell for months, simply because they couldn't afford to buy their freedom.
So the least restrictive means
Imagine finding out your
forces
electric
judges
bill
to look
is
for
secretly
alternatives
funding
to
the
jail.
government's
Like
massive
electronic
spending
monitoring.
addiction.
Right, if the person isn't a guaranteed
pretty shocking
flight risk.
realization.
But the unintended consequence, according to critics, is that these reforms force judges to release dangerous repeat offenders back onto the streets.
You swore to your
Even
family,
when their gut
hand over
tells
heart,
them the person is going to reoffend.
that this money
Exactly.
was strictly
Politicians
for fixing
have
a leaking
absolutely
roof.
swarmed this issue.
You said,
Oh, yeah.
if we
Governor
don't fix
Joe
this
Lombardo
roof,
strongly backed
the house is
sheriff.
going to collapse.
He released a
It's an
public
existential
statement saying
crisis for the
Sheriff
House.
McMahill
Exactly.
and
It's
Metro
the Save the
were
House
right.
Fund. And U.S.
But then,
Attorney
you know, your
Sigal
car breaks
Chaddha
down,
also
you spend a little
publicly
too much on
praised the
groceries,
sheriff
you've got
for
bills
holding the
piling
line.
up.
So what do you do?
Meanwhile,
You raid
critics
the
of the
roof
sheriff have pointed out
You
that
take that
Nevada's
money,
Attorney
pay off your
General
credit
Aaron
cards, and tell
Ford
your family,
has
hey, don't
remained
worry, we'll
totally
fix the roof
silent on
later.
the standoff.
The
And in
political
this
pressure
scenario,
is just
the roof is the
massive
fight.
right now, or at least Maryland's
It highlights how
climate goals.
bail reform
And the car
is
is
arguably the most hotly
self-inflicted
debated topic in the entire criminal
$1.5
justice
billion
system.
Because
state
every
budget
elected
deficit.
official
A
knows
completely
that
avoidable
one
deficit, I might
high-profile
add.
crime
Welcome
committed
to
by
the Deep
someone out
Dive.
on bail can
Today
end
we're
a
exploring a
political
classic
career
case
overnight.
of fiscal
It's
sleight of
happened
hand
before.
coming
Here's
out of
where it
Annapolis.
gets really
We
interesting.
are looking at the Strategic
If a
Energy
judge
Investment
orders
Fund.
someone onto
SAFE.
monitoring, but the police
It's a
run
huge
the
pot of
monitors,
money
who
meant to
actually
save
owns
the
the on
environment.
switch?
But it's turning
Like,
into a
does the
hidden
judge have the
tax
power
on
to
every
force
single
the police
person
to do the work?
paying an
Well,
electric
that is the
bill in
million-dollar
Maryland.
legal question right
It
now.
really is. It's
The
become the
judge
center of
issues
a
the mandate,
huge political
but the
fight.
police operate
You've
the
got
physical
a Democratic
equipment.
governor, frustrated
When those two
environmentalists
entities
making some
violently
very awkward
disagree, the
compromises,
gears of the system
and conservative
just
critics
jam.
who are
And to
rightly
try and
calling this
prevent
whole
those
thing a
jams,
shell
courts
game.
have
shell game.
increasingly turned
And
away
when
from
you
human
look at the
intuition.
documents we have today,
they started relying
reports,
on mathematical
budget
tools
proposals,
to predict
critiques
human
from Senate
behavior.
Republicans,
They use
it
risk
is really hard to
which is
unsee
the
it.
Our
perfect
mission
time
for
to
this
look
deep
at
dive
the
is simple.
cold,
Follow the
hard
money.
statistics in our
Always
sources.
follow the
Let's
money.
do it.
We are
Because
going to
Westbrook's
see
argument
how a
about
fund
due process
designed to
assumes
fight
the
climate
system is
change
perfectly
is being used to plug
Right.
holes in the
But when
state
you look
budget.
at how courts
And we'll
actually
dig into the
calculate
argument that
risk,
this isn't found
it
money
relies
at
on
all.
algorithms,
This is essentially a backdoor
which opens
tax
up a
on
whole
families.
different can of
Let's
worms
get
about
right into
predicting
it.
human
The Strategic
behavior.
Energy
really
Investment Fund. It sounds very
The
official,
pretrial
very
justice
important.
frameworks
What does it
in our
actually do?
sources
Well,
outline
on
exactly
paper,
how this works.
It is the
Okay,
state's
how so?
green
Well,
piggy
pretrial
bank.
risk is
The
defined
SIF
very
is managed
specifically
by
in
the
the data.
Maryland
It
Energy
measures two things:
Administration. Its whole
the
stated
likelihood of a
purpose
defendant
is to
missing a future
reduce
court
energy
appearance,
bills, cut
and the
waste,
likelihood
and
of them
fund
committing a new
renewable
crime
energy.
before their
Like
trial
solar
happens.
panels and
Okay,
efficiency
so how do
upgrades.
evaluators
Exactly.
actually
But
calculate
here is the
this?
real aha
They use
moment
two
of this
categories
story.
of data. First, they use
Where
static
does the money
factors.
actually
Static.
come
So
from?
historical
Because
facts
they aren't
that
just
never
taxing
change.
you
Exactly.
directly for it.
Things like the person's
No, and
age
that's why
at their very
politicians
first
absolutely
arrest,
love
or
it.
the
It
total
feels
number
free.
of past
So
felony
about
convictions
40%
they
comes
You
from
cannot
regional
erase
carbon
or
auctions.
improve static factors.
But the
No,
big
you
chunk,
can't.
the
But
one
then they
growing
mix
like
in
crazy,
dynamic
comes from
factors.
something called
Okay,
alternative
and those are
compliance
variables that can
payments,
fluctuate over time.
or ACPs.
Which
Does
is
the
just a
person
fancy
currently have a
government
job?
term for a fine.
Do they struggle
Right.
with substance
It's a fine
abuse?
for
Do they have
failure.
a stable
Let me break
home
it down.
address?
Maryland
Got
law
it. So
forces utility companies
the
to buy
court
a
plugs
certain
all
amount
these
of green
static
energy.
and dynamic
They have to
factors
prove they're
into
using
an
renewables,
algorithm,
and it
but if they can't
spits out
find
a
that green
numerical
energy, or if
risk
it's just
score.
way too expensive on
Exactly.
the market,
Which
Now,
it
when
usually
we
is.
look at
Yeah, the
national
state gives them an
pretrial
escape
data,
hatch.
the numbers
the
look
utility can just pay a fee
surprisingly
directly to the state
They do.
instead.
That
According
fee
to
is
the
the
pretrial
ACP.
frameworks,
And here's
fewer
the
than
kicker.
2%
Utilities
of
are
felony defendants
increasingly
in large
just
urban
paying the
counties
fine
commit a
because it's
new
cheaper
violent
than actually
crime while
buying
waiting
the
for
green
green
energy.
energy.
less than 2%. That's really
the climate
And
fund
in
is
Washington,
getting
D.C., which has a
incredibly
very robust pretrial
Precisely
services
because
agency,
the green
overall
energy mandates
rearrest
are
rate
failing.
was about
Precisely.
8%.
It is
And
a
in Chicago,
completely
less than
perverse
1%
incentive.
of felony
The
defendants
government made the
caught a
mandate
new
so
violent
aggressive
charge
and the market
pending
is so
trial.
distorted
So those
that
national
power
numbers
companies are
strongly
just writing
suggest
checks
that
to the
releasing
state
people
instead of
before
going
trial
green.
is
And the
generally
stats
very
on this are
safe.
just
and the
staggering.
algorithms
They
are mostly
are.
getting it right.
In
Right.
2022,
But
this
the
revenue
Nevada
was
Department of
$77
Corrections
million
data
tells a
By
much
2025,
harsher, much
it jumped
darker
to
story about long-term
$365
recidivism.
million.
And just to clarify,
Wow.
recidivism
From
is the rate at
77
which
million to
convicted criminals criminals return to prison after they are released.
So now the state has this
and the Nevada numbers
massive
are
accidental
Very
pot
heavy.
of gold.
The state
It's
tracked a
supposedly for
massive
green
cohort of
projects.
inmates who were
But remember,
released
that
in
money didn't just
2016.
fall out of the sky.
And they
The
found
utility
that
companies paid those fines.
24.6% of
And do you
those
think
released
those massive
inmates returned
corporations
to prison
just eat that cost
within
out of the goodness
36
of their
months?
hearts?
Almost a
Oh,
quarter
absolutely
of them
not.
failed
They passed
and went
every
back
single
behind
penny
bars.
of that
And
on
the
the
data
customer.
pinpoints
Exactly. It
exactly
shows
when
up
they
right
failed,
on your
too.
electric
Yeah, the
bill.
first
So
12 months
you,
after
the
release
everyday
are by
ratepayer,
far the most
are
dangerous
paying for
window.
the utilities
Over
failure to meet
13%
the
of the
mandate.
returning inmates
The state
fail in
collects
that
your
first
money,
year alone.
drops it in the safe, and
13.3%
look at all this cash we have for the
Yeah.
climate.
Why is
Which
that
brings us
first
to the
year
raid.
such a cliff edge?
Because that money is definitely not
the shock
staying
of
in the climate
reintegration
fund.
is
Not
massive.
anymore. Enter
You
Governor
take someone
Wes
who has
Moore.
lived in a
His
highly
administration
structured,
is staring
restrictive
down a
environment,
projected
and you drop them back into
$1.5
society.
billion budget
In that
deficit.
first year, they face extreme hurdles securing housing. You can't just
finding
ignore
employers
all that
willing to hire
You
a
can't.
felon,
and avoiding
when
the old
government
social circles
overspends
that
to that
encourage their
degree,
substance
they start
abuse
checking
or
under the
criminal
couch
behavior in the
cushions
first
for
place.
loose
That makes a lot of
change.
sense.
But if they
Except
survive
here,
that
the couch
first year,
cushion is the green
the data
energy
shows
fund,
they stabilize.
and the loose
The
change
longer
is
they
hundreds
stay
of
out,
millions of
the safer they
taxpayer
become.
dollars.
So what's
By
the
month
actual
31,
proposal?
how much are they
The
taking?
return rate
The
drops to
governor's
just
plan
2.2%.
diverts $292 million directly from the safe into the state's dramatically changes
Just
their
to balance
risk
the
score.
books.
Oh, absolutely.
Just to cover their
The
overspending.
data shows that the longer someone is
They are
locked up,
using
the
energy
higher their
fines to
chance of
pay
returning
for
once
general
released.
government
The
operations.
sources note that if
Bureaucracy,
an inmate stays in
salaries,
prison for
office
33
supplies, you
years,
name
their
it.
probability
But that's
of
not even all
returning
of it.
reaches a
Yeah.
I read in the
massive
sources there's also a
47.8%.
rebate scheme. Almost half.
Yes. This is the
But the
part
data
critics
also
are
offers
calling a
some
political
concrete hope
sweetener.
It
They're
does.
grabbing
It proves that
another
intervention and
$100 million
rehabilitation
out of the
actually
fund to
Yes.
give a
Inmates who
one-time
successfully
$40
completed
rebate
addiction
to
prevention
eligible
programs,
households.
vocational job
$40.
training, or
Earbucks.
higher
So let me get
education
this straight.
programs,
The
while
state
inside
mandates
had
drive
a
up
measurably
energy
lower
costs.
probability of returning
The
to
utility
prison
companies
than
pass
those
those
who
massive
just
costs
served
to
their time
you
in
and
the
me.
cell.
And lowering
Our bills
these
go
return
up by
rates through
hundreds of
programs
dollars a
actually
year.
saved the state
And
of
then the
Nevada
governor takes a chunk of our own money, hands us back a crisp
That is money that
$40
goes back
bill,
into
and
infrastructure,
basically
schools,
says,
and state
"You're welcome."
operations.
That is the
Wait,
exact math.
if national
It's
data
wild.
shows
And if you
less
look at the
than
recent
2%
supplemental
of
budget,
felony
they're cutting
defendants
or
commit
shifting
new
another
violent
$80
crimes
million while
when you
waiting for
add all this
trial.
up, this
But
raid
Nevada's
depletes
data
the fund
shows
by
almost
82%.
a quarter of
82%
released
of the
prisoners
fund
end
wiped
up
out.
back
Wiped
behind
out.
bars.
Leaving only
Yeah.
about
Are
164
judges
million
looking
for
at
the
the optimistic
actual
green
pretrial
initiatives
stats?
it was legally
Well,
meant
sheriffs
for?
are looking
That
at
is
the
not a
grim
trim.
recidivism
That's a total
stats.
gutting.
This raises such an
And this
important
is where the
question, and
politics
you've hit on
gets
the
super
exact
interesting.
cognitive
Because you would
disconnect
assume the
driving this standoff.
environmentalist
Really?
groups like
Yes.
the Sierra Club or the
The judge
Chesapeake
is
Climate
managing
Action
a highly
Network,
specific,
you'd assume they'd be
short-term
furious.
pretrial
They
environment.
were.
The judge
Initially,
looks at the
when
algorithmic
this
score
first
and says,
leaked, they called it
statistically,
unacceptable.
based on
They
national
said it was a
averages,
huge
this person
mistake
will
to
likely
use
show up
this
to court
money as a
and stay out of
petty
trouble for the next
cash
90
drawer.
days. But then
the
they
sheriff
folded.
is
completely
managing the
folded.
long-term
Now
reality of the
they are
streets.
actually
Exactly.
supporting parts
sheriff
of
sees
the
the
governor's
recidivism
spending
data.
plan.
The
Talk
sheriff
about
knows that a
strange
guy with
bedfellows.
35 prior
Why
arrests
on earth would
fits
they
the
do that?
exact
If they
behavioral
truly believe
profile
climate
of the
change is an
24.6%
existential
who
crisis,
chronically
why let the
reoffend.
state
So the
raid
sheriff
the
sees a
survival
career
fund?
criminal,
It's
not
just
just
raw
a
political
short-term
calculation.
statistical
They know
probability.
voters are getting
Right.
crushed by
They're looking at
inflation and
two
high energy
entirely
bills right
different
now.
sets of
If these
mathematical
green groups
realities to
attack a
define the
$40
exact same
rebate,
human being.
even if it's a
Wow.
total gimmick,
And that
they
philosophical
look like they don't
conflict
care
brings
about
us to
working
the
families.
ultimate
So they have to
functional
play the game.
question.
They are swallowing
How
a
does a
very
system
bitter
designed
pill.
with checks
In
and
exchange for
balances
letting the
actually
governor
resolve a
raid the fund
complete
today,
deadlock?
Well,
they are
because the
lobbying
numbers
for a
show a
new
real
law to create a
quantifiable
funding
risk,
floor in the
and
future.
the local
Meaning
officials
what exactly?
refuse to budge.
Meaning they want to
This fight
guarantee
has moved
that the
all the
state
way
will
up the chain.
mandate
The standoff
roughly
is now sitting on the desk of the Nevada Supreme
$365
Court.
a year on
Metro
climate spending
formally
moving
filed a
forward.
petition
So they are
asking the
throwing
state's
today's
highest court to
taxpayers
intervene.
under the bus
Right. They
to
want the
lock in a
Supreme
permanent
Court to
claim on your
issue a
wallet
writ.
later.
That's the
stopping
gamble.
the Justice
And it
Court
brings us
from
right
forcing
to the
them to
core
release
conservative
defendants
critique.
into their electronic
People
monitoring
like Senate
program.
Minority
They
Leader
want a
Steve
definitive
Hershey aren't buying
statewide
this
ruling
spin at
that
all.
the sheriff
Not for a
holds the
second. Let's
final
walk
veto
through their
power
argument, because it
over
really
who gets the
exposes the
GPS
math
ankle
here.
monitor.
They call it
And
the
there's a
hidden
major
tax.
complicating
Let's
detail
be
here.
rigorous
Always
about
is.
this logic.
A completely different
Step
judge
one,
in the
the
system,
state forces a
District
green
Court
judge
Judge
Eric
that is
Mendoza
totally disconnected
recently
from
ruled on a
economic
separate but
reality.
Step
identical
2,
case.
the
Right, and
utilities
she
can't
ruled the
meet
Metro
it, so
actually
they pay
does
the
have the
massive
authority
fine.
to decide
Step
who
3,
enters their GPS
utilities
program.
raise your electric rates
So that
to cover the
ruling
fine.
gave
And
Sheriff
step
McMahill
4,
a major
the state
legal
grabs
victory,
that
but
fine
it does
money to
not
pay for
officially
general
bind
government
Judge
bloat.
Goodman's lower
Exactly.
courtroom.
So
in effect,
Exactly.
the state is
So what you end
taxing
up with
electricity
is this
users to pay for the
fractured
DMV or
legal
state
landscape
salaries
where
without ever
different
having to
judges
publicly
in the
vote on a
exact same
tax hike.
county
Hershey
are
says
applying
Maryland
the
families
rules
are
differently
being
just
double
depending on
billed.
whose
You pay your
courtroom you
regular
walk
income
into.
taxes,
Which is
and then you pay
exactly
this
why
massive
critics and
surcharge on
supporters
your
on both
electric
sides
bill.
are demanding that the
incredibly
Nevada
sneaky.
legislature
It's politically
step in.
convenient.
They want
Yeah.
lawmakers
And
to
there's a
rewrite the
second
laws
layer to this
clearly.
criticism.
Right. They
the sheer
argue that
hypocrisy
judges
of
and
it all.
sheriffs
this
should
is
not
the
have to fight a
most glaring
constitutional
part.
battle over separation of
Politicians
powers
constantly tell
every
us
single
climate
time
change is an
a repeat
existential
offender
threat.
comes through the
They
booking
say the world
desk.
is burning.
The legislature wrote
Code
the bail
red
reform
for
laws
humanity.
back in
Right.
2021.
We have zero
so the
time
legislature
to waste.
must clarify
critics
the
are asking a
boundaries
very
of those
simple,
laws.
very
And
devastating
until
question.
they do,
If
or
this is the
until
most
the Nevada
urgent crisis
Supreme
in
Court
human
issues
history,
a binding ruling,
why is the climate
the
fund
entire
the very
justice
first
system
thing
in the
you
state
raid
remains
when
in
you
a state of
overspend
high
your budget?
tension. You
It really
don't
does.
raid your life-saving
So what does
surgery
this all
fund
mean
to
for
pay
the
off your credit
listener?
card.
Exactly.
If the Supreme
The
Court
critics
decides the
argue
sheriff
this
gets
proves
the
the whole
final
climate
say,
panic is
does
just
that
rhetoric.
effectively give the
When
police
push
the
comes to
power
shove,
to overrule
keeping
a
the
judge's
government
bail
bureaucracy
decision
fully
permanently?
funded
Well,
is
if the
way
Supreme
more
Court
important
sides
to them
with the sheriff,
than the green
it
projects they
fundamentally
claim are
shifts the
vital for
balance
our
of power
survival.
in the American
They treat the
justice
fund
system.
like a slush
It means a
fund,
judge
and it
can declare
entirely
a person
undermines their moral
legally
authority.
eligible for
If the
freedom
money
under the
isn't sacred,
Constitution.
then the crisis
But
clearly
law
isn't as
enforcement
urgent as
can
they claim on
effectively
cable news.
block that
Let's
freedom
talk about the
by
real-world
denying access
consequences
to
of
the
this.
required
Because
supervision tools.
while
It essentially
politicians are
makes
moving
the
hundreds of
police,
millions
rather
around
than the
on
courts, the
spreadsheets,
final
it affects
gatekeepers
the
of
actual
pretrial
grid.
release.
Exactly.
What gets left behind
Let's
when you
briefly
drain
recap this
82%
wild
of the
journey.
fund?
We started
programs
with a
for
judge
electric
and a
heat
sheriff
pumps for
locked in a
low-income
fierce
households
power
get
struggle
slashed.
over Joshua
And
Sanchez-Lopez.
a heat pump actually
A man
lowers
who's
a bill for
35 prior
maybe
arrests
15 to
really
20
pushed
years.
the limits of bail reform.
Instead,
And
they're
we saw how that
sacrificing
specific
long-term
standoff
infrastructure
ended
with
with
a
a
$36
$40
political
shaved mail
handout
key
that
a
might cover
suspected
your
fraud
groceries
lab,
for 2 days.
and
They're also
27
cutting
new
electric
school
felony
buses,
charges that
induction
validated the
stoves,
sheriff's
solar
fears.
projects.
But
We
here's the
impartially
ultimate
review
reality
the
intense
intense
constitutional
before
arguments
this
on
rate,
both sides,
with all this
too.
massive
The defense
spending,
arguing
was
for strict
Maryland
due
actually
process and
hitting
separation
its
of
climate
powers,
targets?
and the
No.
police arguing
Not
for
even
clear
close.
public safety
The
and
Climate
resource
Solutions
management.
Now
And we
Act
dug
demands
into
a
the hard
60%
sociology
emissions
and
reduction by
statistics.
2031.
The static and
60%,
dynamic
that's a
factors,
massive
the risk
target.
It's huge.
algorithms, and the
But a
stark
University
reality
of
of
Maryland
recidivism
analysis
that drive
shows
these
that under
high-stakes
current
decisions
policies, the
every
state
single
is
day.
only
It's a
going to
lot to
hit
take in.
40 to 45%.
We want to remind you why
They
this
are
matters.
miles behind.
This is not just
we are
legal
missing the
jargon
targets. The
happening
grid
in a
is getting
courtroom
more
far
expensive.
away. This
And
is
now,
about your
the money
community.
intended to fix
It's about
is
who
being
holds
flushed
the
into the
ultimate
general
power
fund
to cover
to balance your
It is a
constitutional
cascade of
rights
failure.
against
The
the
administration says
physical,
they can
everyday
walk and
safety
chew
of your
gum at the
neighborhood.
same time.
And the
meaning
rules they
balance the
establish in
budget
this
and save the
Nevada
planet.
Supreme Court case
But
won't just
you
stay in
can't
Las
drain the
Vegas.
fuel
No,
tank
they
and
will
expect
echo
the car
across
to
the
cross
country,
finish
shaping
line.
how police
And think
and
about grid
judges
stability.
interact for decades to
When
come.
you force
We want to
these
leave you with a
transitions
final thought
faster
to
than
mull over
technology
today.
allows,
If the
and you
current system
penalize
forces a bitter
reliable energy
choice
sources,
between a
costs
judge's legal
explode,
theory of
and the
due
grid gets
process
fragile.
That's
and a
exactly why
sheriff's
those fines are so
street-level
high.
experience
Reliable
of
green
risk,
energy just isn't
will the
available
future
at
of
the scale the
justice
law
eventually
demands.
rely
So the
entirely
state
on
is
cold
literally
mathematical risk
penalizing the grid
algorithms
for the
just
laws
to
of
remove
physics and
human disagreement
economics.
And instead
altogether?
of